All right, so like Emily said, I'm Haley Sater. I basically work with fruit and vegetable growers, mostly here on the Eastern Shore, but sometimes in other parts of Maryland. And yeah, today I'm just going to be talking about strawberries because people love them a lot. This area here where we live on the Eastern Shore actually used to be one of the top producing strawberry areas of the United States. That's no longer true. Nowadays, California is really the top producing strawberry state, which is followed by Florida. They produce a lot of the early strawberries that you'd be getting closer to Valentine's Day. And then California supplies the bulk of the rest of the strawberry season, so most of the summer. But if you've ever grown strawberries before, you know that they taste a lot better when they come from your own garden than when they come from the grocery store. So we'll just be talking about best ways to produce them at home. And this is going to be kind of specific to Maryland. And so before I get started, I'm going to talk to you about places you can go if you want to sit down and actually read through some of this information yourself. The University of Maryland's Home and Garden Information Center has a couple of different info pages on strawberries, and some of the information in this talk comes from that as a resource. You can usually call up your local extension agent, and even if they are more of a corn and beans kind of extension agent, they can probably refer you to somebody else who knows a little bit about home horticulture. The American Horticulture Society puts out some good information. The National Gardening Association, as well as, you can always go to your local library. You'll notice what I don't have on here are blogs and info pages, like, for instance, I think the spruce, or some of these info pages that you'll get when you type in, say, strawberry diseases. And that's because I find that when I look through some of these, I often find information that maybe isn't correct or isn't presented in a way that I think is scientifically accurate. So a lot of times I would prefer, at least when I'm trying to look up information about a horticultural subject, I like to go to extension or some kind of source that I know that the person putting out the information has a science background. So just a little bit of history about strawberries. They are a hybrid species. So you are not going to find anything like the kinds of strawberries that we get in the grocery store out in the wild. And the reason for that is because the cultivated strawberry that we grow today comes from a cross that happened in a garden in France in like the 1750s. And so the parents of the modern day strawberry are Fragaria virginiana, which is from the eastern part of the US, from the Appalachians, and then Fragaria chiloensis is the other parent, and that's from kind of the beachy areas of Chile. And so those were in a garden. They cross-pollinated and created the modern day strawberry, which actually has 8 sets of chromosomes. And if you know anything about human genetics, you know that we only have 2 sets of chromosomes. Now we have 23 different chromosomes, but we have 2 of each set, 1 from mom, 1 from dad. Whereas a strawberry is going to have 4 from the mother and 4 from the father. So having so many different chromosomes, having 8 sets of each actually can contribute in fruit to having a larger fruit size. And so that's kind of part of the reason that this is the common strawberry, because larger fruit size makes it easier to pick, easier to spot on the ground, and basically you're getting more for bending over. So some of the general requirements of growing strawberries, if you're thinking about putting strawberries into your backyard, make sure that your soil has at least 2% organic matter or higher. I can tell you that soils on the Eastern Shore, for the most part, are very sandy, and they're not going to have that much organic matter. So if you were just going to till up a part of your yard and put in strawberries, I would recommend amending that soil with something that has high organic matter, like say peat moss or coconut coir or broken down wood chips. Something like that is going to add organic matter, which is really good for soil structure and soil health. Strawberries need a slightly acidic to kind of neutral pH. They need about the same range of pH as most other garden vegetables, so 6 to 6.5. And don't think you're going to get away with putting strawberries into a garden and not watering them over the summer. They do require some kind of irrigation. And so really in the heat of the summer, I like to use a drip line. So I have kind of a soaker hose that I run through my garden. And that kind of works best for me. You can also overhead irrigate. So that would be just like using a sprinkler. But when you have wet foliage or wet leaves, that can lead to leaf diseases. So in general, that's why we always recommend using a drip hose over using a sprinkler overhead irrigation. And then if you're putting strawberries in, don't be putting them in the shade of your oak tree. They really need to have at least 6 hours of sun a day. So you can get away with areas that have partial shade, but really, like most garden vegetables, strawberries need full sun. So before you plant, I was kind of talking about soil before, but you can make sure that your soil is going to be right for planting by just taking a couple of different soil cores or samples. And if you do that, you want to dig about 8 inches down. You can use a garden trowel. The root zone of a strawberry is not very deep. They're only going to access the top foot of soil, and the majority of the roots are going to be in that top 6 inches. So if you have a well-drained sandy soil like what I have in my yard here in Salisbury, that's going to be great for kind of controlling pathogens, because sitting water is what's going to really enable some of those molds that affect roots to get in to your plants. Now, if you're in an area of the state where you have like a heavy clay soil, you may want to think about mounding up your strawberries kind of into a hill and then planting down that line, the way you might for some of the cucurbits, because they really just don't like to have wet feet. And that's what we call, roots that are sitting in water. Yeah, so here's kind of a map of the different soil textures of Maryland. And you see, we're not really a continuous state in any way. Over here on the Eastern Shore, we just have very different soil material than what you have out here in the Piedmont. So yeah, make sure you know your soil type before you plant into the ground. And now none of this is going to apply to you if you're, for instance, planting into containers or garden beds where you put in all the soil yourself. So this is only for people planting into the ground. Okay, so types of plants you would want to buy. So of course you can buy a full healthy plant, but in general, if you're going to be putting in quite a few strawberries, I would recommend doing something like buying plugs. So this image here on the right, this would be an example of strawberry plugs. They're basically seedlings grown in little pots. Or you could buy bare roots. There are some nurseries where you can purchase the bare roots plants either in spring or fall, and then they'll be delivered to you. And they're basically dehydrated, and then you would rehydrate them to put them in the ground. And then runner tips, that's not going to be not going to be widely available to you, but these are going to be a little bit more economical ways to plant a bunch of strawberries than if you just buy a full healthy kind of plant. I think, I'm trying to remember how much I paid for 25 plugs or 25 bare roots plants, but I know it was a lot less than I would have paid at a garden center. Okay, so why don't we plant strawberries from seeds? If you Google search this, you will find all kinds of people that are planting strawberries from seeds. I don't recommend this, and that's because whenever you're planting a seed, at least of most fruit, you're getting a random individual. You will not get an individual that is the same as the strawberry parent, the strawberry that seed came from. This is not true for some vegetables. Some vegetables you can plant the same seed over and over again, and you basically get the same genetic individual. But strawberry seeds, they're really tiny. They're kind of a pain to get out of the berry. If you did decide that you were going to plant from seed, you would need to expose them to a 4 to 6 week period of cold because they need that cold in order to germinate. And then you basically have to baby that seed because it's really tiny. It's going to create kind of a small and weak seedling that you're going to have to kind of spoon feed to get established. So I don't really think it's worth it to plant strawberries from seed. So pollinators, if any of you guys have other fruit gardens, you may know that, well, most plants in your garden are going to require some pollination. And for strawberries, the flowering window is usually going to be from April to May, usually late April into May. And strawberries are the same as blackberries and raspberries. They all require some pollination, so you need a bee to come and visit that flower, but you don't need 2 different varieties of strawberries for cross-pollination. So some other fruits like apples or blueberries are going to require cross-pollination. So you're going to have 2 different genetically distinct individuals to get fruit. And so when you're planting, you're going to want to make sure that it's either springtime or fall, and that's because you just don't want to be planting into high heat conditions. That's going to really stress out a new plant. So if it's above 85 degrees or if it's about to be above 85 degrees, if you wait until say June on the Eastern Shore, you'd probably be putting in your plants a little bit too late. So then I would recommend, not planting until fall, if you don't already have the plants. If you have bare roots plants, you want to make sure that you soak them. This is just an image of bare roots plants. I think if you've never ordered them before, you might think, what is this dead plant that somebody shipped me? But really you just soak them and they're going to send out new green growth once they get established in the soil. And then if you are planting in the spring, like I did last year, you're going to want to take off any of the spring or summer flowers of those plants in the first year. And that's because, not because they won't make fruit, because they could make fruit, but that first year, you're going to want your plants to really get established. And a plant basically only has so much energy in its budget. So it can either put that energy and those carbohydrates into making fruit, or it can put them into making more vegetative growth and getting established in your garden. So the first year we kind of want to train the plant over the summer to get established into the garden. So another thing about strawberries in particular in a garden is that they don't compete very well with weeds. So whatever you can do to keep weeds down is going to be a good choice, because as you can see by their growth habits, strawberries, they're low growing. If you get weeds coming through in your garden, they're going to shade out the plants. Your air circulation is going to go down. So if you can cover them, not the plants, sorry, if you can cover the ground with straw, that can help to suppress weeds. Or even better is to use something like a weed cloth or a weed mat material. And there are lots of different kinds of weed mats out there, but that's really going to help you stay on top of, keeping grasses and other things you don't want in the garden from getting established. Or a strawberry plant is a good mom because she supports a lot of daughters. And what we mean by that is strawberries tend to take over the area that you plant them because they self-propagate. So they send out runners, which then kind of become a carpet over time. And this shoot right here is a runner. And what the runner is doing is it's establishing kind of an umbilical cord to that daughter plant and supplying the nutrients from the mother plant until this daughter plant establishes its roots and then has enough leaves to support itself and create its own carbohydrates. So that's what I mean by daughter plants. And when you're planting out your mother plants or your initial strawberries, you're going to want to space them between 14 inches to 2 feet apart. And if you space them too tight, what's going to happen is, well, it's just going to be a really tight carpet really fast, because in the first year, these plants are going to be sending out daughters and trying to establish themselves in other parts of your garden. So if you're going to be doing different rows of strawberries, your row spacing, you're going to want to use 4 feet in between rows. It's important to plant your strawberries at the right height in the soil. So what I mean by that is that the crown, or this part right here that all the different leaf stems feed into, that needs to be right at the soil surface. So you don't want to plant the crown below the soil surface, and you don't want to plant it too far above the soil surface and have any of the roots sticking out, because that's going to dehydrate the plant. When you dig a hole twice as deep and as wide as the plants, and then backfill it with soil. That's going to be especially important if you're amending your soil with, say, organic matter or compost. And then gently pat the soil down around your plant. And then after you plant, you shouldn't be fertilizing right away. You should wait 6 weeks before you fertilize those plants. A lot of times if you fertilize a plant right after you plant it, you can kind of shock it because it really hasn't established itself in the soil yet. So you want to give it a little time. June bearing versus everbearing strawberries. I think this is, if you walk away with nothing else, this is probably one of the most important things to understand about strawberries if you're going to just plop some into your garden. A June bearing strawberry is going to produce fruit generally in June, but sometimes the last couple of weeks of May, just depends on the variety. But they're only going to produce fruit for 3 to 4 weeks. And the fruit is generally going to be a little bit larger than the everbearing types. And then these are a couple of the cultivars that we recommend from Maryland. So All-Star, Chandler, Delmarva, Early Glow, that's a good early variety with tiny fruit, lots of flavor. Flavorfest, that's a new one. Jewel, that's an older variety. And then Keepsake, that is the newest variety of all of them. And so all of these are going to be good choices for Maryland. Probably the same is true for, surrounding states. But in general, these June bearing strawberries, they're only going to have their one shot at the beginning of the year, whereas everbearing strawberries, which are sometimes called day neutral strawberries, they are going to be producing fruit all summer long. So they're going to be making flowers up until, it starts getting frosty in the fall. They are not going to make as many runners, so they're not going to have as many daughter plants, and it's going to take them a longer time to fill up a garden bed. However, this is my caution to you if you are planting everbearers. They really don't do that well in the summer heat and humidity. So when temperatures start getting above 85 degrees, that's when you start to see like melting fruit, the plants get stressed. A lot of the diseases that affect strawberries that we'll go over, those start to come out. So I think here on the Eastern Shore, where it tends to be hot and humid, we're like at 25 feet above sea level. So we don't really, people with elevation kind of in Western Maryland may have better luck with everbearers than we have, or people up in Pennsylvania. I know they grow some everbearing strawberries, but you can try them in your garden. I don't think they're impossible to grow. I just think you're generally going to have more success with June-bearing strawberries. And if you do want to try everbearing strawberries, or you are in a place where you have a little bit milder summers, these are some of the varieties that we recommend, at least for the mid-Atlantic. Then, just because I saw these in the grocery store the other day and I bought them, I figured I would talk a little bit about white strawberries. So these have been around for plenty of time. You can find white strawberries in the wild, but the cultivated white strawberries that you may start to see in grocery stores, I don't know how they do in Maryland because I haven't tried growing them. Many of these cultivars are everbearing, so I'm assuming that they aren't going to like our really hot, humid summers. But yeah, there are a couple of commercially available different types of white berries. They are said to have, at least some of them are said to have kind of a different flavor than red strawberries. So this pineapple crush, I know they're supposed to have more of a pineapple-y flavor. So they're at least worth trying. The ones I bought in the grocery store, I did not think were that special, but it's always nice to be able to compare the different varieties of fruit and see if you can tell a difference in your own garden, because anything you're buying at the grocery store is going to be, harvested several days before. So that's going to affect the flavor. Nutrition for your plants. If you're growing June-bearing strawberries, you're going to want to fertilize roughly 1.5 to 2 pounds of a balanced fertilizer. So what I mean by a balanced fertilizer is that it would have roughly the same amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So those are going to be the three numbers that are on the front of, generally on the front of a fertilizer bag. And you're going to use this for roughly 100-foot row. So if you only have a 10-foot row of strawberries, just divide this by 10. And then you should be applying your fertilizer twice per season. The first, I guess, if you're establishing your plants, you're going to be fertilizing in September. And it's really important to give them that fall or late summer shot of fertilizer, because those are the nutrients that plant is going to carry over and use to come out of dormancy in the spring. So it's really important that you give them that fall dose of nutrients, and then you can fertilize them again after they've fruited in the summer, generally after pruning them. Whereas if you have everbearing strawberries, you are going to want to give them a little bit less fertilizer at a time, only half a pound per 100-foot row, but you're going to do it more frequently. So because the Everbearers are making fruit all summer long, you're just going to kind of spoon feed them a little bit of fertilizer at a time. And you can calculate actual fertilizer rates using a couple of different guides. If anybody has a question about that, you can let me know in the chat, or I can give you some sources for that. So nitrogen is the most important nutrient that you're going to be giving to your plants. And I wanted to give you an idea what plants that are nitrogen deficient actually look like. Strawberries are considered heavy nitrogen feeders. They have a lot of green tissue. So compared to like a woody plant, something like an apple tree or a blueberry bush, strawberries need a lot more nitrogen. So nitrogen is going to be important for a whole bunch of different things in the plant, but because it's used in chlorophyll, you can imagine it's important for green tissue. And so it contributes to the total biomass, or basically the total growth of the plant. It's important for runner initiation, so for your plants to make daughter plants. It's important in some ways for fruit formation. Also, fruit quality can be affected by nitrogen, and then it helps the plant resist diseases. So you can imagine that plants, the same as humans, if they're getting a balanced diet of the nutrients they require, they're better able to fight off diseases. So that's why it's important to make sure that you're not seeing symptoms like this in your strawberries. So this kind of reddening of the leaves. And kind of the reason I point out the nitrogen deficiency here, usually in a lot of your other garden plants, when you start to see nitrogen deficiency, you see kind of a yellowing, but especially in strawberries, that chlorosis or that yellowing is accompanied with this red pigmentation along with it. So it looks a little bit different than a lot of other garden plant nitrogen deficiencies. Okay, so yearly maintenance of strawberries. You do actually, if you have June-bearing strawberries, you should be pruning them in the summer. So what that essentially means is you're renovating them, you're cutting them back after they bear fruit, and this is going to kind of help rejuvenate the plants, because you're going to have a lot of old kind of spent leaves, and this is going to cue the plant to make new growth. And you're basically, if you have a strawberry bed, you can keep it for between 3 and 5 years generally. After that, you tend to want to replant. Your yields are going to go down. You're just going to see less productivity overall in your bed after 3 to 5 years. Overwintering strawberries. I know that last week, John talked a little bit about winterizing your cold crops, but the same is true for strawberries. So you don't have to do this, but especially if you want to have a slightly earlier crop and you want to protect the flower buds, you can put something like a mulch of some kind or a row cover, specifically these clear plastic covers that go over metal hoops or some other kind of hoop. Those are going to kind of act as a greenhouse for your plants, and they're going to increase the temperature inside. So you're going to get a little bit more heat in there, which is going to help the plants grow, and it's going to protect you from cold damage. So this is an example here of what a flower bud looks like after it's been damaged by temperatures that would be somewhere below 28 degrees. I mentioned earlier, but the strawberry plants, the June bearing, are going to be flowering towards the end of April or early May. And if you're having really cold temperatures, so a day where it's going to get to, or a night where it's going to get below down to 25 or 20 degrees, you're going to start to see damage like this to your flower buds. A lot of times this doesn't kill the fruit, but what it does do is cause the fruit to grow out and be deformed, like these example pictures here from University of Delaware. Okay, so now we're going to talk about all of the different diseases and pests that can hit your strawberries. And example here are two different kinds of sapsucker bugs. So both of these, potato leafhoppers and strawberry aphids, are going to be insects that can pierce into the plant and drain it of what it needs. So aphids you need to be looking for kind of earlier in the season between May and June. So about the time when fruit is getting ripe, whereas leafhoppers are going to be hitting a little bit later in the summer between June and August. And the types of damage that they're going to do are anything to the chlorosis that you see, so the yellowing of the leaves here, all the way to kind of deformed leaves and kind of total defoliation of your plants. And then the other reason you don't want to see bugs like this are because they can spread different viruses. So you can imagine that, you know, if they're attacking your plant and then jumping over to the next plant, they can be carrying different diseases with them. So here's what you should be looking for aphids. Leafhoppers are going to be a little bit tougher. You're going to want to look on the underside of leaves for leafhoppers. And it helps if you have like a little magnifying glass, something like this, like a jeweler's magnifying glass, or just a low 10x sort of magnifying glass can help you really like identify some of these pests. And if you are seeing these in your garden, you definitely want to wet the foliage. You can spray if you're growing organically. You can spray something like neem oil, or you could use some soapy water to get rid of especially aphids. Sap beetles and tarnish bugs. These are problems more for the actual fruit that you're going to be growing. So these are the adult stage is what's going to be causing the problem. The sap beetle is going to feed on the overripe fruit, and this is kind of what the damage looks like. Whereas the tarnish bug, it's going to be hiding in the weeds if you have a weedy strawberry bed, and it's going to actually affect the bloom and cause these deformed type fruits where you see all the seeds and the tip of the strawberry didn't really grow. These are some of the most prevalent bugs that you're going to see in your strawberries. And then, of course, there are going to be slugs. I think every time I've grown strawberries, I always see some slugs out in the garden, but they're pretty easy to take care of. You can set slug traps. You can be really cruel and salt your slugs, but slug damage is pretty easy to tell because they will feed a little bit on the foliage and cut these great big holes in it. And then this is what it looks like when they feed on the fruit. They take big chunks out of it. So moving on to strawberry diseases. Crown rot diseases, I think, are probably the most serious and detrimental to any strawberry patch. So there are a lot of different types of crown rotting diseases, and what they will do is they will cause the plant to basically collapse. So if you see in this picture, this is a more or less healthy plant, and then this one, but it looks like it's got a few symptoms here, and then this plant is already suffering from a crown rot disease of some kind. You may see some kind of fungal black spots on your leaves, but basically what's going to happen is the plant is just going to start dying off. And these are going to be more of a problem in poorly drained soils. The reason for that is because whenever you have a lot of standing water in the soil or the roots are staying too wet, you're basically inviting some of the slime mold pathogens to get into the roots. And once those have infiltrated the roots, it's kind of like the plant is already sick and immunocompromised, and then these crown rot diseases move in. And many of those also live in the soil, or they can be moved via wind and spores. But basically, if you start to see any of your plants kind of collapsing or wilting for no reason, like they're not water stressed, then you should be removing them out of your soil. Do not put them in your compost pile with all of your other plants that are going to decompose and become your future garden soil. Throw them away or burn them because you don't want to be reintroducing. A lot of these are molds or fungal pathogens. So you don't want to be bringing those fungal spores back into your garden. So basically get rid of these plants if you're seeing this, because it's not something where you're going to be able to treat it and fix the problem. Now, leaf spot diseases, these are going to be a little bit less serious. I know I have a lot of growers who get really concerned about these, but they're more or less just going to happen on older leaves. So by October, you're going to see some leaf spot issues in your strawberry patch. And they're not usually going to have like a serious detrimental effect on yield. These are three of the most common leaf spot diseases. So there's actually strawberry leaf spot, strawberry leaf scorch, and then leaf blight. And they're all a little bit different, but basically they can be caused by there not being enough air circulation, wet foliage. So you want to make sure that you planted into an area where you are getting that full sun and good drainage, and where there is air circulation. And then also making sure that you control the weeds around your garden bed, because that's going to, if you have weeds, they're going to be shading your plants. They're going to prevent some of the air circulation that you need and keep the foliage wet. So another reason just to control weeds. But in general, I don't worry about the leaf spot diseases if I see them in the fall. If you're seeing a lot of them in the spring, then they may be something to control. But in general, you would just pick off leaves that have leaf spot diseases. Okay, so some of the fruit diseases that you no doubt have probably seen in your own strawberries, probably in your fridge. If you've ever, bought a bunch of strawberries, put them somehow they got pushed to the back of the fridge, you pull them out 2 weeks later, you are definitely going to see some gray mold and some anthracnose fruit rot. So the gray mold is when the fruit gets all fuzzy, and the anthracnose is kind of that soft brown spot. And these are more or less everywhere in the environment. They're both fungal pathogens. You're not going to be able to get rid of these in your garden. They are just in the environment. Make sure that you're harvesting your fruit when it's ripe, because they tend to happen on fruit that is ripe or overripe, is when you really start to see them develop. And these two diseases are part of the reason why I at least don't try to grow everbearing strawberries, because you see them a lot when it's hot and humid. And so it's another reason too, if you're picking strawberries, even from your own garden, you should be refrigerating them unless you're going to eat them immediately, or you will start to see some of these molds growing on them. Just a couple of planting methods that are fairly popular. Obviously, you can plant into bare soil, as long as your soil conditions are right and you don't have super heavy clay soil, you shouldn't have a problem with that. Just make sure that you're giving your plants adequate space, so at least 14 inches. If you're planting into, say, a planter box like this one, give them a little bit more space than what you're seeing down here, but you can space them a little bit tighter. If you're going to be planting into kind of a non-traditional system, good options would be something like a long pot. I see more and more of these, especially if all you have is a balcony or a very small yard, strawberries fit really well in these long containers or in like even a window box. And then you can space them significantly tighter because basically the fruit are actually going to grow, outside of the box. And I think they look very pretty. Tower pots, these are kind of becoming popular. If they weren't so expensive, I would have some, but if you don't have a lot of space in your yard, or then they can be a good option to grow, vertically. And then hydroponics. So I think this is another cool way to grow strawberries. It's happening a little bit in greenhouses and commercially. And all of these methods are good ways to keep yourself from having to bend over to harvest. I think that's honestly one of the biggest advantages, because if you spend more than 20 minutes harvesting strawberries, you begin to understand why it's nice to have a crop that is grown at a 4-foot height instead of at ground level. So I don't know. I think these are good options if you want to try something new. Definitely make it easier to prevent weeds, like in these hydroponic systems. It's just a lot easier to fit a lot more plants in a small area, and you don't have to worry about some of these, issues that you would traditionally have to deal with in a garden. But yeah, I think that's all I wanted to cover in this talk. If we have any questions, I see a lot has happened in the chat.
We do have some questions for you, Haley.
Okay.
People have been loving your talk. It was very good. So if you guys don't think I'm going to make that berry pun like 3 more times in this talk, you were sadly disturbed. So, okay, so some of these questions you sort of touched on already, but we're going to go ahead and let you reiterate on them. So I found a strawberry that's not a common variety that we typically find in stores, but I want to plant it. So best way to grow from seeds.
So the question is, should they try to grow it from seed?
Yeah.
I kind of touched on this, but yeah, when you grow something like a fruit from seed, you are not going to be growing the same individual that you bought or that you ate. So when you eat a really good strawberry and you think, oh man, I want to grow that, you're going to the seeds of that strawberry are going to be basically the children of that strawberry, and they're going to be genetically different. They're going to have a mix of some of the same genes, but they're not going to be what we call true to type. That's part of the reason we wouldn't recommend you going to all the effort to plant a seed when you're going to get a genetically different individual in that next generation.
Okay, awesome. So you touched this early on, but when is the best time to plant strawberry plants?
Early in the spring. So actually, when soil temperatures start getting up to 50 degrees-ish in my region on the Eastern Shore, that would be, kind of like end of March through April. And then I wouldn't plant after the end of May. And then you can start planting again in the fall. So that would probably be September through middle of October in this region. But basically when it starts to not be, 90 degrees every day.
Okay. So for the bare root plants, how long do you recommend soaking them for before planting?
Just like 20 minutes or so. They don't have to soak like all day or anything. You're just kind of getting them hydrated and waking them up so that when they're in the soil, especially if you're planting into dry soil, they're gonna start growing immediately.
Okay. So one person asked if they should remove the runners from their plants in order to get them to produce more berries.
So that's kind of a trade-off. In general, runner initiation is going to happen after fruiting, but there is kind of like a plant energy balance. If you're thinking that you didn't have a very good crop like your first year, and you're seeing that your plants are making a lot of runners, you can cut them back. And definitely, I mean, the easiest way to do this is you just kind of mow them down in roughly July here. That'd be the renovation. And then when they pop back up in the summer, they're going to be making all new growth. And usually they're not putting out too many runners, but that's kind of variety specific.
Okay, so when should the row cover be removed?
Oh, good question. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. I think it's about this time of year when the soil temperature reaches like a high enough degree. That's when you usually pull the row cover off. But you can have really cold nights, or especially during pollination or flowering, when you might put it back on. So depending on how difficult your row cover is, I may have to look that one up.
Okay, I'm sure if this was your question, you might try checking the University of Maryland Home and Garden Information Center strawberry page, and they probably will have, it's fairly temperature dependent, like Haley touched on. Okay, I didn't fertilize in the fall. Should I fertilize my established plants now or wait until after fruiting?
After fruiting. So part of the reason we tell you not to fertilize during fruiting or during flowering is because if you're giving the plants, so nitrogen is important for fruit development, but too much nitrogen can lead to like soft fruit, poor quality fruit. It can also lead to the plant putting more energy into vegetative growth instead of into the fruit. So generally, even if you forgot to fertilize them in the fall, just wait until after fruiting and then fertilize them twice in future years, but never during fruit production.
Okay. Will fruit ripen inside, or does it need to ripen outside and then be brought in?
So it could ripen inside if you have enough light for it. So generally, the limiting factor for most of your vegetables, if you're trying to grow them indoors, is not it's not temperature, it's light. Because, you know, unless you have a plant light on them, they are not going to be getting enough sun in a window. I think most windows block out, like, compared to being outside versus my plants that are here in a window, which you probably can't see, they're getting only 10% of the light that they would get outside. So yes, you could grow strawberries under a plant light, or in a hydroponic system that has a light above it in your house. You're going to need that extra photovoltaic source.
Okay, so best way to go about taking a soil sample, or best way to test soil?
So there are a bunch of different labs that will do it for you. What you would do is just go into your garden bed, and if you have more than one place or more than one kind of area where you're growing plants, I would make it like 2 separate soil samples. So if you have a front yard garden and a backyard garden, I would do those separately. But you're going to go around and take like a garden trowel that's maybe 6 to 8 inches long, and then just take a shovel full of dirt, probably 15 to 20 samples, and you're going to mix those around in a bucket, and then you're only going to need 1 to 2 cups of that soil. So you can dump the rest out, save 1 to 2 cups, put it in a plastic bag unless it's dripping wet. If it's dripping wet, let it dry down a little bit. And then like for instance, in my extension office, we have a lab that we at least will come pick up soil samples directly from our office. I don't know if all of the extension offices in the state do this. I think we're relatively close to the lab, so they come and pick up from us. But you can mail off your soil sample to one of these many different labs. We just happen to use one called AgriLabs up in Delaware, but there are other labs all over, and they will test your soil for AgriLabs, I think it's $10 for the basic soil sample test. And that's what I would recommend. Just to
Awesome.
make sure you have good pH and enough organic matter and whatnot.
So how long approximately before green leaves and runners would appear when a bare root plant are planted?
Oh, okay. This can depend a little bit. If like last spring was, I felt like a little bit colder and a little bit later. So it can be, I think it took about a month before some of my bare roots plants were doing any, or maybe not a full month, but some are going to come out of dormancy faster than others. I would give them at least a month before they start initiating green shoots. And that's going to be, weather dependent.
Okay, awesome. So now we have some that are a little bit more specific to varieties themselves. So if these were your questions, I didn't forget them, guys. I just wanted to hold off on them a little bit later to get a lot of the general stuff. So what are your thoughts and tips on growing alpine strawberries?
So alpine strawberries, I know that a lot of the white strawberries are in that group. I've never tried to grow them. I would think that they would do better in kind of higher elevation regions of Maryland. And they're probably more adapted to like the soil types that you have in the Piedmont. That said, I haven't tried growing them yet. I think that most of the alpine types are day neutral too. So I've stayed away from growing those, at least in my own garden.
Okay, and then someone asked, is it possible to grow, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced these guys, Ozark and then Omisaka strawberries?
Ozark is not one of the varieties that's recommended for here. I'm pretty sure that would have been bred at University of Arkansas. So climate-wise, that's roughly the same zone that we're in, but it's just not on the list of like recommended varieties for Maryland. It could be susceptible to like some disease that's very common here or whatnot, but I'm sure you could try, like anything with the name Ozark, I'm pretty sure it probably came from Arkansas, and usually whatever is developed in Arkansas does okay in Maryland. I don't know about the other one though.
Okay.
Little research.
Let's see. After 3 to 5 years, dig up the bed and plant more. I can't see throwing out plants. Couldn't you move them even if they were not giving as much, but still giving?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of up to you how you want to run your personal garden bed. Commercial growers are only going to have strawberries in for 1 to 3 seasons, basically because your yields go down over time. What's also going to happen is your bed is just going to become too dense. Like one of the last pictures I showed, that garden bed had become just saturated with plants, and the older mother plants, after 3 years, those really just need to be dug up. Those are kind of done being productive. But if you dig up the daughters every year and keep replanting in new places, you'll get new daughters the next year. Or if you dig up the mothers each year, you give some new space for daughter plants to fill in. So if you keep your bed from getting too saturated with plants, that can work too. But they're going to keep multiplying every year.
I just saw one. So you talked a little bit about pruning for the June bearing varieties. Do you need to prune for the Everbearing as well? And if so, when?
So the Everbearing aren't going to be as aggressive about runnering and making daughters. It's still a good idea to prune like old or kind of crappy looking leaves, but you don't just go through your bed the way you would with the June bearing and just like mow them all down, because the Everbearers are going to make fruit up until, it starts getting frosty outside. So in this region, that could be, end of October. But then if you really want to do like a hard prune, you would do it right after it gets cold. It's just that you want to be careful that you don't prune them back too hard so that you have a light crop.
So someone asked about growing strawberries next to other fruits and vegetables. So do you have some that you recommend avoiding putting strawberries around, or are there some that make good companion plants for strawberries?
Yeah, I am trying to think here. I think that strawberries and the Solanaceae, they host a lot of the same diseases. So I wouldn't put strawberries next to any of your tomatoes, eggplants, or peppers. And if you are rotating where you put things in your garden, don't put strawberries or tomatoes, peppers, or potatoes. Don't do them right after one another because I think they get a lot of the same root diseases. But as far as companion planting, I wouldn't put strawberries right next to anything because they spread and they take over and they don't want to be shaded out by a taller plant. So I kind of like to keep strawberries separate in their own bed. I don't know if, and then I'm thinking about the cucurbits. So they're not even going to be active at the same. So the time of the year when strawberries are growing and making fruit, at least June bearers, is kind of more in the same window as cole crops because they are more of a spring plant. But I keep them separate from everything else. And I don't know, I think that if you're rotating, say like garden beds, strawberries are a good choice after you've grown any of the brassicas or cole crops, because cole crops actually can kind of cut down on certain soil diseases. So if you were going to grow broccoli this year and then put in a bed of strawberries, that would be a much better choice than growing tomatoes in that bed and then putting in strawberries next year.
Awesome. Okay, so containers. So for growing in containers, about how big do they need to be and how deep would they need to be? The idea of growing in gutters seems a bit too shallow.
Oh, so the gutters, I think the picture that I was showing, this picture here, this is a hydroponic system. Can you see that?
We can see it now, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so this is hydroponics. So if you're growing in a container like this one here, that looks like it's about 8 inches. That's about as deep as you would need. You do not need, you need something a little deeper than 4 inches like the plugs that you get. But a strawberry only has roots down to 1 foot, even in the open soil. And 90% of those are going to be in the top 6 inches. So really like an 8 to 6 inch depth pot is going to be fine for a strawberry. If you're using like a 10-gallon bucket or something a lot bigger, you can you're kind of using more soil than you need to, which is fine, I guess, if your soil is free. But if you're buying kind of expensive like Pro Mix or something like that, I would really suggest using something a little bit more straight and narrow, like this image here, because it's going to be easy to harvest from, and you're not going to be having to add extra soil than what you need. And then these hydroponic plants right here, they're going to have completely different root systems than a normal plant, because when you do a hydroponic system, you're giving that plant all the nutrients it needs. It's going to be a little bit different than growing in real soil.
Okay, awesome. Any thoughts on wild strawberries? Can you eat them?
Yeah, you can eat wild strawberries. They're usually not going to be like as sweet. Sometimes they don't have any flavor. Plus, there are some berries that look like wild strawberries that actually are like a different genus, I think. It may even be the next level. But there are a lot of different little red berry fruits that you can find wild. That said, if you don't know, if it's not, don't just try red berries that are growing on something in the woods that, look small, but there are a lot of different wild species. And one of the parents of the cultivated strawberry is Fragaria virginiana, which is native to this region. So if you're hiking in the Appalachians, you may see wild strawberries, and they are perfectly edible.
Yeah. Along that note, we would recommend that you not forage for any food that you did not know where it was grown. So do not pick anything that you find on the side of the road, because you don't know if it's been treated, or anything in your backyard if you have a dog. So do you have a favorite variety of June bearing and Everbearing that you would recommend?
A lot of commercial growers use Chandler, and I don't like Chandler that well. Early Glow is kind of not like, it has a lot of flavor. I still haven't grown Flavor Fest, but just based on the name, I'm assuming that it should be a very good berry. That's a new one that came out of the USDA breeding lab in the last 5 years or so. So I want to try that one, but I think I couldn't find plants last year. And then Keepsake, that's another new one. I think a lot of the breeders are trying to breed better, more flavorful strawberries now than they used to, but they still have to balance that with disease resistance and all these other factors. So I want to try some of these new varieties. I know people like Jewel. Yeah, I have Early Glow and Jewel and a California variety. I will know more after this June, which one I like the best too.
Awesome. So for those of you guys that do not live in Maryland, we would recommend you reach out to your local extension office to see what varieties they recommend for your local area. There were a few people that asked about that. We got one last one from Betty. So if the plants do not have fruit, what fertilizer would you recommend?
Oh, I would use a balance if you can. So that would be something like 10, 10, 10 or 12, 12, 12. And what all of those numbers mean is the first number is always nitrogen, then phosphorus, and then potassium. So that's going to balance all of those macronutrients, which are the three kind of most important to deliver to the plant that they're not maybe naturally going to have in the soil. But that said, if you get a soil test done and your soil test says that you have plenty of phosphorus, you could go out and buy a fertilizer that only had nitrogen and potassium.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Haley. There are lots of comments in the chat box about how amazing your talk was and how everybody learned a lot. So with that, thank you guys all so much for attending. This talk will be up on the University of Maryland Lower Eastern Shores YouTube channel, probably by this time next week. And I believe we will also send out an email that has the link once we get it up online for people to be able to rewatch it or to share it with friends if you have anyone else that you know who's interested in growing strawberries. And I believe in 2 weeks, Rachel Rhodes is talking about oddball vegetables, I think is on the agenda. So hopefully you guys will come back and tune in then.
Emily, what's an oddball vegetable?
It's a vegetable that's mildly odd. No, we're going to talk about some of those less common vegetables next week. So nothing like tomatoes or peppers or squash. I think Rachel's going to talk about asparagus and broccoli raw and all those kind of weird vegetables that you may not have thought to grow in your garden, but are completely possible to grow. So I don't know if she'll touch on okra, because I know that's one that a lot of people like, but is easy to grow, but is super itchy. So not everyone likes growing it. But who knows? I actually have no idea what she's going to talk on. So if you want to know what she's going to talk about, you have to tune in 2 weeks.
All right. Thank you all for coming.
Have a great afternoon, guys.
Bye.